Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Welcome to the Ray Charles Performing Arts Center. This is the choral rehearsal room, and welcome to Morehouse College, the place where I had the very good fortune of meeting the distinguished gentleman that we're going to hear from tonight. I have said over the years there have been three people that have been most instrumental in my early years of music development as a student here at Morehouse College. And one of those people was the late Dr. Wendell P. Whalen. And two of those people, one is on the way, and the other sits in that seat there. Dr. Anderson was unquestionably one of the most important and influential figures in my training, and I am honored that he is back with us. And he has influenced not only me, but so many others, including in this room. Ms. Jacqueline Howard, who is here with us this evening, who, by the way, was a student of Dr. Anderson's and was on NBC Nightly News on Friday night. And congratulations again to you, Ms. Howard. Great. It is a wonderful and rare experience to have someone who has had so many years of experience in the field as a composer and working musician, and who has interacted with so many other great musicians. This man is someone whom I consider iconic in every way in terms of composition, certainly in the 20th and now in the 21st century. And in that sense, the influence that he has had on numerous students of composition, other contemporary composers, and the world of music in general is something that we are certainly going to long hold as a valuable part of our experience and his connection to Morehouse College. I would like to welcome you again and thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to share with us, and I will not take any more time. We will have the formal introduction by Dr. Robert Tanner, and then we will hear from this great man, Dr. T.J. Anderson. Thank you.
We are indeed very fortunate to have with us tonight a composer whose long and illustrious career has spanned and transcended numerous genres and stylistic boundaries. Dr. Anderson's compositions include commissions from such celebrated artists and groups as the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Symphony Orchestra, the American Wind Symphony, the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, tenor Uzee Brown, and cellist Yo-Yo Ma. His vast body of work is infused with the sensibilities of modern music in its totality, from Webern-esque serialism to post-bop jazz to reimagined interpretations of spirituals and gospel. Dr. Anderson's work as a composer has earned him numerous awards and accolades, including honorary membership into Phi Beta Kappa, multiple fellowships at New Hampshire's prestigious MacDowell Colony, a residency at the Rockefeller Center for the Creative Arts in Bellagio, Italy, and honorary degrees from several institutions, including College of the Holy Cross, West Virginia State College, his alma mater, and Northwestern University. Again, it is a pleasure to introduce to the Department of Music and to the Morehouse community someone who is certainly no stranger to us, but whose presence is always welcome. Please join me in receiving Dr. T.J. Anderson.
Thank you, Robert. I have to laugh when you stood up. I remember when I was with Robert Shaw, we would always laugh because people stand up when a noted person comes on stage, and he said, "They're standing up, I haven't done anything." So, he said applause should be earned, he said, so you have to sort of watch it when it happens. I'm certainly a pleasure to be back at Morehouse. It's a school that I had the privilege of spending 3 years here. This was the academic year 1969 to 72. And I want to talk about those years because I think several important things happened during that time. I also want to say I can't walk into this building without thinking about my friend Wendell Whalen, who had an influence on Dr. Brown and everybody else that comes through Morehouse. It's just a man of great integrity, tremendous skills, And I just enjoyed Wendell's sense of humor. Wendell was really a funny guy, and he had a great sense of humor. And we were students at Iowa together, so we got to know each other well. The first thing I would like to talk about is really not connected with Morehouse, but it's connected to Spelman. I want to read you something, and this is the announcement that just came out. And this is that Alvin Singleton has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And I want to say that this is the highest form of recognition of artistic merit that you can receive in this country. In other words, it's equal to being knighted in England. So this is really important. There are only 250 members of the Academy, and somebody has to die before somebody else can get in. So it's a very difficult organization to get in. And this, it started in 1898, and there are three divisions, three committees. One, art, literature, and the other committee is the music committee. Now, in the music committee, there are only 46 members. And of that number, there are only currently 5 African Americans in it. And one is Arnett Coleman, Tanya Leon is a member, George Walker, the distinguished composer from California, from Berkeley, Ollie Wilson and I. And of course, you can see by the numbers that we are nowhere near the representation we should be. And I might add, there are only 2 Hispanic composers in it. So it's a rather pathetic organization in terms of its record of who gets in, and we're certainly trying to change that. But now I want to turn my attention to Morehouse and its significance in my life. It was on this campus that the beginning of the Black Music Caucus took place. Now, what happened was that the Music Educators National Conference had a meeting. This is the biggest educating group in music in the country. And this was a national meeting, and I was scheduled to take part in the panel. And we looked up and we suddenly found out that there was total ignorance of the African American contribution to this meeting. They had one session planned, and this was a session with Jester Harrison, my friend and graduate of Tufts University. Jester's most known because he wrote the song Amen of Lilies of the Field in that movie. That song Amen was written by Jester. Well, what they wanted to do was have Jester come and speak on the Negro spiritual. I thought it was indeed insulting to have only one session, and the South is really the cradle not only of African American music, I would say of American music in general. And the second thing is for them not to pay any attention to Morehouse and Spelman in terms of the long tradition that they have had in music. I thought that was totally insulting. So what I did is I called a meeting. I assembled most of the black attenders to that meeting, and we met. Water. we met over in. Thank you. We met over in a room on this campus, and we expressed our disgust to each other, and we decided to form the Black Caucus. It's called Black Music Caucus of 72. That was the name of the organization. When we met, everybody said we have to have an organization of permanency. So I was elected chairman, and I was indeed fortunate that I had 3 people that were really instrumental in the development and formation of the organization in terms of the formation of its constitution and all the business work that has to be done in something, in organizing an organization of a national perspective. And the first person I want to talk about is Warwick Carter. And I knew Warwick Carter when he was a student at Tennessee State. Warwick went on to become president of Columbia College in Chicago. Now, Columbia College is very interesting because Columbia, while Warwick was president, in fact, even before Warwick became president, but certainly Warwick assisted the development of the Center for Black Music Research under Samuel Floyd. And that turned out to be one of the major centers of research on African American music in the country. The other person that was very much involved in our early days was Georgia Ryder. Georgia Ryder was Dean of Fine Arts at Norfolk State, a very talented woman and certainly instrumental to our early stages of development. And the third person is a guy I knew from Tennessee State also. His name was Eddie Meadows. Eddie Meadows was an ethnomusicologist and he was a professor at San Diego State, and he wrote a very important book on Central Avenue in Los Angeles, and he was certainly important. Eddie was our secretary. Warwick was our treasurer. We could trust Warwick with the money. That's why we had him as the treasurer. But anyway, the organization got started mainly because there was no participation. And what we knew there were qualified blacks that could be adjudicators. There were blacks that could lecture on music. We knew there were blacks that could participate at any phase of the national convention. So what we did was that we started having our own meetings. And for several years, the National Black Caucus met all over the country. And we met every other year, and we provided opportunities for African American groups to perform in particular. Now, this gave young kids in elementary school, singing groups in colleges, all of the bands and orchestras, things of that nature, a chance to show what they could do. It also enabled them to have critiques by people in the field, African Americans, that could help them develop. So it was a very important development, I think. And what happened is that in later years, another person connected with Morehouse is Ted McDaniels. Ted McDaniels was the band director at Morehouse, and eventually he ended up at Ohio State. Now, Ted was the executive secretary of this organization for many years, and later on he became chairman. And Ted was responsible for the change of the name, and we became the National Association for the Study and Performance of African American Music. And NASPAM is the name, abbreviated name, and this organization is very important because it is still doing work enabling young performers to be seen, and I think that the future is very bright in terms of what we do as a service. Now, I've always been an integrationist, and I don't want you to confuse that with tokenism. I mean, some people think you get one black person in a place and we've integrated. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the full participation at every level of every race as possible. And of course, this is not happening. And of course, this is not just my dream. It was Nelson Mandela's dream. Nelson Mandela said he has trouble with both black folks and white folks. And they said, in other words, some people just don't believe in integration. But if the world's going to survive, it's going to have to be an integrated world. And you just have to work constantly in order to secure the integration of people of various cultures, of various ideas, and various backgrounds to let the whole sense of humanity come forth. Now, in talking about the MANC, the MANC director at that time was Fran Andrews. She was my professor at Penn State. She was furious when she found out that we wanted to form our own organization. They have done everything they could to respect us. In other words, the MANC and the National Music Educators Conference have done everything they could to appreciate our organization and encourage us. But that's not what the goal is. That's not the goal at all. The goal is integration. And so, I mean, I've got the highest honor. I got it. You know, I did one year at the national meeting in Milwaukee. They presented me with their highest honor. The goal has always been and still is that we integrate the society. In other words, the Morehouse College Glee Club or Spelman Glee Club, these groups ought to be appearing at their national meetings. I'm sure they're doing better, but better, I haven't checked what they're doing lately, but I'm sure better is not enough. But it's up to your generation to constantly work at getting the reality of what an integrated experience is like. Now I want to shift to something that I feel very close to and is a very important part of my life, and that's jazz. I was a jazz musician. What happened is that I started off on the violin. My father was teaching at Howard University, and I switched to the trumpet. I was from one of those neighborhoods. It's easier to switch than fight, you know. So I switched to the trumpet, and you call the trumpet a work instrument. You can play that in clubs. The violin, you couldn't. So my teacher was Louis von Jones. When he went to study in Germany, it was Louis Jones. When he came back, it was Louis von Jones. Now he wanted to be a concert violinist, and he was a very good musician. But what chance would a black in the 30s? What chance would a black musician playing the violin have? I mean, what orchestra is going to hire him? In fact, you look around in most orchestras today, black musicians aren't present. And I mean, this is still a problem we have. I mean, I know for a fact, I see blacks coming out New England Conservatory all the time. I see them at Tanglewood. But these kids don't have careers in classical music. So I'm saying we still faced with the same problem. So after I went to, started off in jazz and started playing around, I went on the road as a teenager. Now, this was a very interesting experience. I played with Tate Wilburn's band out of Cincinnati. Now, what I experienced had a tremendous effect on my future. First is that we would play dances from 10 to 2. That was the standard routine, 10 to 2. So after the dance was over, you had to look for a party or a jam session. Why? You couldn't go to the hotel because the bus was leaving 6 o'clock in the morning. So we had to have some place to hang out. Usually it turned out to be a park bench where you're going to sleep in. So you had to figure out a way. The second thing I witnessed was that we would play for a club. The place would be packed. And after we played, the man that owned the club would come up and they said, boy, it was a bad night. He said, well, what about all these people here? He said, man, they were all my relatives. I felt sorry for them, and I told them come in because I didn't want you to be disappointed. They didn't pay to get in, you know. So you had to argue about your money. You had to argue about your money. The next thing is that these were the days when you had white shirts. And I'm talking about cotton shirts, not cotton shirts that you could wash out and they dry and they look good with polyester, none of that. White shirts. The shirts would get dirty. You'd sweat and you'd be playing. And at the end of the night, we'd put the shirt aside. Next day, we'd white talcum powder, pat all over the shirt, and we'd be off to the next gig. We'd be playing. So I decided then and there that I knew that this wasn't the kind of life I would live. The other thing is that I love jazz. I still do. I'm still a jazz fan. And my last experience was when I was teaching in High Point, North Carolina. I formed a band, and there was three of us. And we practiced and practiced and practiced. Never played a gig, but practiced all the time. You know who was in that band? Jackie McLean, who played with Miles Davis. Danny Richmond, the drummer, with Mingus. So that's my band. We're not working, but we practiced it. So I knew by that time that I was teaching high school public school music, I knew that this was not the place to make a career in music because it was so difficult for jazz musicians. I remember Frank Foster, who played with Count Basie for years, told me he went into a jewelry store to get credit, and he was making something like $125 a week, and that was unheard of in those days. He said he couldn't get credit. He had to pay cash for the ring he put on his wife's finger. Couldn't get credit, a jazz musician. I'd say, I'm so glad I wasn't there. But anyway, the other thing is that I can remember so many good friends in jazz and being honored. One of the honors I've received is the pianist James Williams out of Memphis. Now, James is a marvelous jazz musician, and one of his pieces is dedicated to Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, and T.J. Anderson. I thought that was great. He thinks of me in those terms. Now, I mention him because James did not smoke or drink, but he died of smoke inhaled in a club. The environment of clubs. I mean, didn't smoke or drink. And so I just wanted to mention that for all of you that are thinking about a career in jazz. Now, after I finished Penn State, where I got my master's, I finished West Virginia State and Penn State, I received honors there from my professor, George Saiger. And he said I had talent in music. And since I got honors in composition there, I said I wanted a second opinion. So I went to the Cincinnati Conservatory to get this second opinion. And I studied with Scotty Houston. And this was really great because he told me I should go on, and with that I went on to the University of Iowa to get my next degree. Now, in jazz, there are 3 books I'd like to recommend to you that you should try to get a hold of. The first book is by George Russell, and this is the first jazz theory book that's ever been written. It's called The Lydian Mode Concept. Now, the reason this book is so important is that it caused the shift from jazz progressions to linear jazz. In other words, up until that time, most jazz pieces that you played were based on chord progressions. But then, all of a sudden, you switched to modes. The classic example is Miles Davis, or So What? That's the classic example. And it influenced not only Miles, but Ornette Coleman was influenced by this book. So this is a very important book. Now, although George, who was a close friend of mine, George was a jazz musician, and he's known for Cubano B, Cubano Bop that he did for Dizzy Gillespie. George also, with the Lydian mode concept, can analyze all the classical music too. That's why it's important. It's a theory that can be used not only for jazz but for classical music. The second book I'd like to recommend is a book about Thelonious Monk, and it's by Robin D.G. Kelly. And the book is called Thelonious Monk, His Life and Time and Art. Thelonious Monk is, as you know, most of you know the piece Round About Midnight. That's his most famous piece. But Thelonious Monk was a genius in that he actually brought dissonance into jazz that never has appeared there. So he began to expand the harmonic vocabulary, and the harmonic vocabulary with the extensions of intervals up. I'm talking about ninths, 13ths, and all of those kind of things. You know what I mean. Anyway, Thelonious Monk was responsible for that. And he played up in the stratosphere. He played up there. And Thelonious Monk was very antisocial. He was loved by musicians, hated by other people, and certainly made a major contribution. And the thing I like about this book is that Robin Kelly had access to Thelonious Monk's wife. In other words, loads of people wanted to write a book on Monk, and she wouldn't cooperate. And what happened is that Monk's son was a friend of Robin Kelly's. So through his son, the son's a drummer, and through his son, he met Thelonious's wife. And that book is important, and it's not just important just for jazz. I'm saying it's one of the important biographers that has been written about American musicians, because everything is documented. Now, a whole lot of it is documented through conversations, a lot of it's documented through written articles and things of that nature. But it's a very important book, and I think it hadn't gotten the attention that it should get because Robin is a leftist. He's teaching at Southern Cal now. But that we in this country tend to put politics ahead of everything. And that's unfortunate, because we ought to put ideas ahead of everything. And Robin is certainly one of the most brilliant writers that we've had, and he's written several books that certainly should come to your attention. The third book is on Louis Armstrong. I met Armstrong when he was appearing at Vanderbilt, and at the time I was working on the orchestration of Treemonisha. Now, Armstrong played with King Oliver, and I asked Armstrong, did he know Joplin? Because Joplin was known to his generation. And he said, no, I didn't know Joplin, but I knew my teacher, King Oliver, did. And the person that wrote this book has written 3 books on Armstrong. His name is Tom Brothers, and he teaches at Duke. Now, the first book he did was Armstrong on tour used to write letters, and these are typewritten letters. There are hundreds of them. And Armstrong would explain what he was doing and everything. So he published a book of Armstrong's typed letters. The second book is very interesting because it traces the sanctified church that Armstrong's mother belonged to Africa. That's a very important book. The third book, and this is a book that's just out this year, is called Louis Armstrong, Master of Modernism. This book is really interesting, and it only goes to about 1930. It talks about Armstrong leaving New Orleans, the people that played with him, and then the musicians that he met in Chicago. So it's very important. That book is dedicated to Ollie Wilson. Now, Ollie Wilson, I mentioned his name before. Ollie Wilson was his teacher at Berkeley. In fact, Ollie turned out 2 important scholars in music. And the other is Scott DeVoe, who teaches at the University of Virginia and wrote a very important book on bebop. And one of the things that I liked about Scott DeVoe's book on bebop is that it talks about the economics of a jazz musician. You rarely see that, but he goes into that. And the second person is dedicated to is Samuel Floyd. I mentioned Samuel Floyd in connection to the Center of Black Music, and Sam has done a marvelous job in terms of publication of what's going on in the field. The third person is T.J. Anderson. Now I want to play a piece, and I'll talk about this piece. This is a piece that was commissioned by Penn State University on the 100th anniversary. And the music is influenced by both Thelonious Monk and Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, I have been influenced by both composers, and what makes this work very unusual is that it's a piano concerto with no notes written for the piano. And so what happens is that the pianist comes out and he has music, but what he has is what the orchestra is doing. In other words, he has nothing to do. All I do is tell him when to play and when not to play. And that's very important. Most people think because you say you can improvise, you can do anything. But the reason I got Donnell Fox is a former student, was a professor at MIT, and he knows both Bach and Monk. So he was a natural for me to want to have this concerto written for. This is the composition Fragments. I'll have to stop it there because I have some other things I want to thank you. I want to devote the last part of the lecture to the opera Treemonisha, which we presented here in Atlanta in '72 with Robert Shaw. I was very fortunate that Wendell, with Richard Long and I, decided we wanted to make a week celebration of the African American experience in music, so we did that. And the opera, which Joplin wrote, was the culmination of the whole week's event. We had lectures on Paul Robeson. We had a lecture by Benjamin Mays, who was a hero in my family because he taught my mother when my father was on the faculty at Howard in the School of Theology. And there were a number of people that contributed to the success of this first performance of Scott Joplin's opera. In most books would have said Scott Joplin wrote a ragtime opera, and that would be all that would be said of this opera. I got interested in it because Bill Balcom, who teaches at the University of Michigan and is a very distinguished composer, was teaching in New York, and he met Rudy Blesh. Rudy Blesh wrote a book called They All Played Ragtime with Harriet Janis, and this is a very excellent book because it's so informative. And Blesh informed Bill Balcom of this opera, the existence of this opera. Now, Joplin was a famous ragtime composer, and he's the father of ragtime, and most people know him because he wrote about 50 rags, and nobody was in the category of Joplin in ragtime music. But Joplin, around the turn of the century, began to recognize that ragtime was declining. It came in about 1890 to about 1920. And as ragtime declined, Joplin looked around and said, I want to do something else. I want to do something else. And he wrote two operas. The first opera was A Guest of Honor, in which the music has been totally lost. Everybody has sightings of it in Pittsburgh in somebody's box, but I mean, nothing has materialized of that opera. He paid to have 500 copies, and this is the genius of Joplin. He paid to have 500 copies, and what he published was the piano version, not the orchestration. He tried to get backers of opera to see it, and they had no interest in an opera. Now, the story for Treemonisha is that there's a woman named Monisha, and she finds a baby under the tree, so the baby's named Treemonisha. What's unusual about this story is that the hero of the story is a woman. Also, I'm going to talk about the unusual features of the Joplin score. The music is strictly American music. It makes use of ragtime. Now, ragtime is a German left hand in which the emphasis on 1 and 2. Da 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 da. Somebody 1 2 da 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 boom da 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 1 2 1 2 1 2. That's ragtime. Bass left hand, German, or Umpass style, note chord, note chord, note chord. And the chord is played by the horns, and the tubas play the first note. This is the German style of the march. The right hand, very unusual. Now, we're talking about the left hand. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Bush. I mean, yeah, I can go on, you know, but everything is on the beat, and dull. 1 2 1 2 3. Now we get to Obama. Boom, boom, boom. Obama. That's not 1 2. That's no. Boom, boom. The accent is over here. Not that. Not that. Not that. Da 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 da, all off the beat. Joplin. Right hand, African American, left hand, German. Integration. Going on in music before you recognize it. And now, it's not just Obama, Mandela, Zambezi, the river, Kenyatta. I mean, African music is not on the beat, it's off the beat. And this off the beat brought vitality to American music. When Joplin did this and put it in his opera, no ragtime. No, I'm not saying it's not a ragtime opera. Don't get confused. I'll get back to this in a minute. But influenced by rag. What did it lead to? It led to jazz, the jazz age of the 30s, and Gershwin. All of this comes from Joplin. Joplin didn't have jazz. What did he have? He had folk music, opera to work with. Now, I spoke to the Society for American Music, and I told them all to repeat after me. Repeat after me. Scott Joplin, is the father, of American music, of American opera. See, that wasn't so hard to say, was it? When I spoke to this meeting, people would invariably say they couldn't associate Joplin's importance with the history of American opera. But what does it have? It has syncopated melodies, recitatives, arias, an introduction, which is an overture. All the ingredients of opera that we know, Joplin included it. Now, we assume that Joplin knew opera from going to places like Kansas City and New Orleans when he was a traveling itinerant musician. So Joplin had a chance to hear opera. He also had a chance to see the potential of ragtime, this rhythm, offbeat rhythm, in the opera itself. There are another things that's unusual about the opera. Joplin, in his score, one section, he has things like this. Notes with no note heads. An abbreviation for a cross between singing and speaking. Now, everybody will tell you that Sprechstimme was invented by Schoenberg. I don't know whether it was before Schoenberg or after, but I know it's on the same page. Nobody will talk about that. Another thing about Joplin. Joplin closes the opera with a real slow drag. And what did he do? He wrote the dance steps in the score. Left foot drags and the right foot slides and all of this. All of that is written in the score. Joplin describes the dance. Now, Joplin is not the first to write an opera in America. All the operas written before Joplin's opera were basically imitation of European music. Now, what is my source? Edith Boroff is a close friend of mine. She knows more about music in the world than practically anybody. She's living at the Forest at Duke now. And I talked with Edith, and I said, Edith, I think Joplin was the first to write an American indigenous opera. She said, yeah, that's right. Nobody's going to say it. So I have to say it. When you look at all the operas written in the 1800s, late 1800s, all of them are basically imitations of European opera because that's all the composers knew. It just came from Europe. Joplin had this vision. So he wrote an opera which has great significance in terms of the history of opera. Now, I get down to the part, this is my first lecture on Joplin. So I get down to the ugly part. This is, when we did the premiere of Joplin's Treemonisha, Rave reviews in the New York Times. Ebony magazine had a big spread on it. Constitution, rave reviews. All of my performers, some of them in this room right now, were invited to Wolf Trap for the performance of Premonition. When they get there and they get ready to perform, what do they find out? It's not my orchestration, it's Bill Barkham's orchestration. So they were under contract, so they had to perform. I wasn't there. When the wailing went up. Anyway, what happened was that Vera Lawrence, who had been a scholar of Joplin, went up to Harlem, got two relatives of Lottie Joplin. Now, Lottie Joplin was Joplin's wife. They were related to Lottie Joplin, not to Scott Joplin. Got them to sign a paper, gave them a couple $100, came back, and they had the Lottie Joplin's, Scott Joplin Foundation. When they did the performance here, I was asked to sign a paper. This was a day or two before the performance. Now, incidentally, all of this can be checked out because it's in my archives at Tufts, all the letters that I make reference to, and you can check the date on this signature when this performance was done. I had to sign the paper because we had to have approval from the estate of Joplin in order for the performance to take place. So naturally, I signed it. I didn't want to get into an argument with lawyers and everything. We had all these people prepared to do it. So we had the performance, and the second performance took place with Bill Barkham. Now, Bill Barkham had done most of the editing of the Scott Joplin opera with me looking over his shoulders. He did most of the work on that. So after the Washington performance, Vera Brodsky Lawrence didn't like that. So she has another performance, and this time it's Gunther Schuller. Now, Bill was at my performance. He had seen my performance. Gunther has heard my performance because he was invited to my house and I played it for him. So Gunther has a version out. So now you got three versions. Now I'll go back to what happened to me. My orchestration, which I gave to the Schaumburg Library, the manuscripts were given to the Schaumburg Library in New York. My version was sent to the American Composers Alliance in New York. They lost the music. I had written proof that they had gotten it, but they couldn't find it. So when somebody said, we want to play T.J.'s arrangement, orchestration of Scott Joplin, we don't have it, we don't know where it is. So for many years, the Joplin's opera of Premonition was the performances was either the Balcom or the Houston Opera Company version of Premonition, which was done in Texas. I didn't feel bad. The reason I didn't feel bad because the performance that we had here was on the Voice of America. And on the Voice of America, I had mine in satellite. They didn't have theirs there. So I got mine up there. They don't have theirs there. So I knew I was ahead of them. I knew it. I just knew it. And I can say to this day, if you want to hear it, get your nonprofit radio station to write and ask them to give you a rebroadcast, and they'll call it in from outer space. Now I only know two performances of my Premonition. One was done in New York. They had a reading, not a stage performance of New York, and the place was packed. I didn't hear it, but I mean, I understand that's what happened. The second was on the 100th anniversary of the writing of Joplin's opera. I went to Chattanooga, University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. And there, I was very fortunate to witness Roland Carter's performance, stage performance, and it was marvelous. So it does exist. And so I feel quite fortunate that this is what happened, what I can report to you about Premonition. when I was speaking on the panel at the Society for American Music meeting in Charlotte, there was a very outstanding musicologist. His name is Edward Berlin. He writes on ragtime. So he wanted to interview me. So he asked me, first thing he asked me is what do I think of the Balkan and Gonzalo version of the opera. I told him I've never heard, and this is the truth, I've never heard any of them. And I deliberately avoided listening to any of them because I knew invariably people would want to say which one is the best. So I've avoided all my life. To this day, I have not heard one note of either version. There's another version out just now being recorded in America, and there's also a version of Treemonisha done in Europe. And I think the music is in public domain. So if you want to do an orchestration, go to it. You know, we can use as many versions as we can get. But anyway, I think the genius of Joplin has to be recognized. The fact that Edward Berliner told me that he has investigated Joplin's marriage, and he said Joplin had a wife before the wife that I talked about. And the first wife died early, and this wife, Treemonisha, is the model of this wife he was first married to. So he's going to have a book come out at some point. He's also in this book going to compare the various versions of Treemonisha. So that should be interesting. At this time, I would love to answer any questions you may have on anything that was said or any questions you want to ask about. Yes?
I'm ready to skin my ignorance, but I'm just wondering where Joplin's writing of the opera leaves off and orchestration begins.
Well, Joplin published a piano version, and in this piano version, what he had was all the music, and he'd have things like oboe and clarinet, nothing more than that. When they did the reading of it, it was not an orchestra president, and of course, it wasn't orchestrated until I did the orchestration of it.
How do you read it? What is the reading of it?
They had singers and pianists to do it, but they didn't have a complete performance. But I mean, you could get an idea of what it was like, but people just weren't ready, way ahead of the time. Any other questions? Yes?
It's more of a statement. I'm astounded with how you pointed out the left hand and the right hand between the up, down, the 1, 2, and I'm just running every European opera or orchestration in my head, and I'm thinking about the basic simple patterns, and then I'm looking at American music. I'm thinking of Stravinsky. I'm thinking of jazz music. Was that the Take 5? I'm thinking about this. My mind is just blown right now. I'm like, whoa, that's undeniable truth in terms of his influence on American music all the way to present day.
Yeah. Well, when you mentioned Stravinsky, people have to realize that Stravinsky was a product of the influence of African art and Cubism. So Cubism comes in. What does Stravinsky do? Stravinsky gets influenced by jazz. James Reese Europe's band in the First World War went to Paris and played concerts. Now, what did they play? They played jazzed up versions of every march you could think of. So the music became infectious, and Stravinsky has acknowledged his indebtedness to jazz. So I mean, music is universal. It has no color, neither black nor white. You know, and I think it's the musician that sees in it the potential, and not bothered by borders.
Right.
Yes.
Why do you think in American conservatories that the greatest music that America has is our African American music, our spirituals, our rock and roll, our jazz? Why is not that lineage taught in the American conservatories? Why is it separated into jazz and European music? It seems to me, as an educated musician, we would want to be teaching our students this music in our conservatories. Why is that not being done?
When you talk about conservatories, the first conservatories in this country were German. And the Germans invaded the universities with musicology. And I remember the time in Fisk, you couldn't play jazz in the building. I remember all these times. So that we have been indoctrinated about the greatness of European music, and to this day, symphony orchestras live on the European diet. No respect for American composers. I mean, I mean, that's just the way it is. And I mean, I would like to say that we've had generation after generation of American composers that had promise, not fulfilled. And until we get back to looking at the operas of American composers, and I might add the symphonies of American composers, the wheel's going to spin. But fortunately, we have one good thing, and that's death. Death. No, all these old people, and I'm one of them, going to die, you know. And so, and I wrote an essay, short, but essay saying the future of the American orchestra may well depend on its ability to improvise. And most people think when I say improvise, I mean jazz. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying improvise in the style of the music that's being written. And I've just wrote a piece dedicated to influenced by Paul Robeson, and dedicated to Nelson Mandela. And it's really based on a whole lot of different types of improvisation, because I believe that the future of the orchestra is based on improvisation. Now people say orchestras don't know how to improvise. That's not true. Most of the brass and woodwind players come out of jazz bands now that are playing in orchestras, or they went to conservatories, so they know what they're doing in terms of improvisation. But also before that, in the Baroque period, all the slow movements were totally improvised. They would just give 3 chords, and you make a whole movement out of that, and the players improvise. So improvisation has been a very important part of the history of music. And I think if our orchestras are going to survive and not be just museums, they will begin to improvise and use composers that use the improvisation. And there are a lot of us that use the improvisation, a lot of composers. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm from Waterloo, Iowa, and I was like 45 minutes from University of Iowa. I want to know, what was your experience like being African American at the University of Iowa?
My experience at the University of Iowa would be just like anybody at the University of Minnesota, the University of Pittsburgh. I mean, I was on a panel with Fannie Lou Hamer once, the great civil rights leader of Mississippi. And she said there's one experience: Philadelphia, Mississippi, New York, Mississippi. Well, it's all the same country. And you have to realize that. You have to realize it. It's just one country. And the racist attitude, it'll become sophisticated. There'll be people, whites that support you. There'll be whites that smile and won't support you. But I mean, you'll figure it out. But I mean, you have to take it on. You have to take it on, because that's what you have to do. So I mean, I had a good experience at Iowa in that Iowa had a reputation of letting blacks graduate. Certain schools didn't. So that's why I went to Iowa. I wrote P.G. Clapp was head of the music department, and I wrote him a postcard saying I'm thinking about coming to the University of Iowa to study music. He sent me a 5-page typewritten letter why I should come there. That impressed me. He died the summer before I got there. Wow. But there are people that are very supportive. I've had a lot of support from people that I really respect and admire. So it's not either or. It's a mixed bag, and it's nationally. I mean, it's not just Iowa. I wouldn't think. I mean, my studies at Iowa just like Penn State. I mean, same thing. Good people and bad people.
Dr. Anderson, can you speak to, on that note, your affiliation, how things evolved such that you became composer in residence with the Atlanta Symphony, and that really what resulted in our good fortune of having you over here, and I want you to, if you would talk about your association. I was
teaching at Tennessee State, and my chairman was Ed Lewis, an outstanding teacher, one of the best teachers I've ever had in my life. And I applied for a residency with the Atlanta Symphony, and Shaw chose me. And it was 3 important years because I reviewed all the contemporary manuscripts that came in, and I would recommend some he didn't perform, some he would perform, and it was a good relationship, and I learned a lot with him. And when I left, I recommended Alvin Singleton, who became resident composer under Shaw, and then he was also with the current conductor of the orchestra, Robert Spano, yeah. So it was just the Rockefeller Foundation. And my contact with the Rockefeller, I tell everybody I'm a Rockefeller baby, really, because they not only put me in residence here, the second year of Robert Shaw put up his own money for me to stay here. And the third year I was a Danforth professor visiting here at Morehouse College. So those were the 3 years that I...
Weren't you were the first, well, that was an appointment, I believe, in Washington with the National Assembly, but weren't you the first?
Yeah, he was the first, but it wasn't successful. They hated each other. He was a good composer, but that was with Rostropovich.
Right.
Yeah, that didn't work out. But yes.
Yeah, earlier you were speaking on the importance of the presence of black musicians on the national level, and as young musicians now, what do you think is the most important thing that we do as young black musicians as far as advancing and progressing music today and in the future?
Most important thing you can do is study. I emphasize that to all my students, to study scores. If you don't know what other people have done, you're just reinventing the wheel. You're wasting your time. You have to study scores, and then your own imagination will take over. But if you don't know what's been done before, it'll take you forever to discover things. Study of scores and knowing theory are the most important things for any composer. And if you don't know that, I mean, you're in big trouble. Yes?
Just on that note as well, being a young composer, as far as like score studying, how much, just knowing like plagiarism and all that, when should you just being, like how should you approach it in a way where you're not, to make sure that you don't end up just mimicking people and having your music. So like if I'm studying Beethoven or Bach, like I just don't get to a point where my music just sounds exactly like Beethoven or Bach.
Well, your music can't sound like Beethoven and Bach because you didn't live in those times. I mean, in other words, your music should sound like what you hear, whether it's rap music, whatever it is, whatever. But you have to have a critical ear, and you have to filter. Everything that goes through your ear isn't good. So you have to have a critical ear, say, I can use this, but I can't use that. And I think another thing I want to emphasize to young composers is that you have to write a lot. I wrote a lot of bad music in my lifetime, and I'm proud of it. No, you have to do it. I mean, how are you going to learn? How are you going to learn? If you got a friend that plays trumpet, one plays clarinet, get them, write a duo for those 2 instruments. But before you write it, look at some pieces that were written for clarinet and trumpet. Because otherwise you're just going in a circle, you know. I mean, and you find yourself very limited in terms of what you can do. Sooner or later you find out you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. And it doesn't work. Not unless you're a minimal composer. And I don't think that works either. Yes?
When and how did you know you wanted to be a composer?
I beg your pardon?
When and how did you know you wanted to compose?
As I said, I was a musician early in life, and I was a jazz musician. And it wasn't until I got in graduate school that I just took this course as an elective. And then I wrote a piece, tone poem of a steel mill. I came from a steel mill town in Pennsylvania, Cokesville. And it was a terrible piece. At least I thought it was hot stuff, you know. But it was a terrible piece. And anyway, but my teacher was very patient and encouraging, and so that's why I just started writing, and then all of a sudden I found it. Up until that time, I've been thinking I was going to be a jazz arranger. I thought I would be a jazz arranger. And in fact, one of the real tragedies of music is that Duke Ellington's arranger, who am I thinking of? Piano player. Strayhorn. Thank you. Strayhorn was, in fact, he wrote Lush Life. Is it Lush Life? Before he met Duke Ellington. When he met Duke Ellington, everything went downhill as far as I'm concerned. I mean, he collaborated with Duke, and they did a lot of good things, but I'm talking about Strayhorn, when Strayhorn was a musician out of Pittsburgh. He had already written Lush Life. Now, when you hear that piece, and that's one of the greatest pieces that's ever been written in jazz, to think that he was there before he met Duke Ellington, he actually thought he could become a Delius. That's what he wanted to be, like the English composer Delius. But he met Duke Ellington, and his whole life changed. And I'm not saying it's bad. I mean, that would be a judgment. But certainly it's different. Yes?
What would you say is your greatest accomplishment?
What?
Your greatest accomplishment to you?
My greatest accomplishment is marrying this woman here. Let me tell you, we have 3 children, all of them successful. 2 of them are here. My daughter Janet, who's an accountant for the police department in DeKalb County. Nita has her own travel agency, and my son is TJ the third. And I want this leads me to a commercial I want to do. At some time in the future, my son was a Fulbright scholar to American University in Egypt. And he has just published a book. It's not out yet, but it's coming. And it's called Cairo Workbook, a book of poems. He's a poet. And I have selected 4 poems and have a song cycle that's going to be performed. And Laura English will be the soprano, and Joyce Johnson will be the pianist. And that work will be performed at some future date. And the reason I take great pride in my son and his poetry is that not only was he invited, he was teaching at American University, he was also invited to teach at the Cairo University, their university. So I think I take great pride in that. He's extremely modest, and I hope when we do the premiere of this piece that he'll come and read the poetry, and then you'll hear the songs. We'll keep you posted on when that event is to take place. Yes?
Was there ever a time where you second-guessed yourself or second-guess yourself or question your possible success in the field that you chose? Or like really something hit you or knocked you down off your horse and you just... No. That's a myth. I mean, people think composition is you just stay out in space and all of a sudden God comes, something comes and strikes you and gives it to you. No, it doesn't work that way. At least it doesn't work that way for me. I know, at least it's been my experience, is that you have to work at it all the time. And sometimes you'll have ideas that don't work. Sometimes you have ideas that do work. But if you don't work at it all the time, or you'll hear somebody will play something and you say, oh, I can take that and use it this way. I mean, that always happens. And all composers have been influenced by other composers. Nobody just wakes up and says, I'm inventing music. Nobody does that. We are all part of a chain. We're all part of a chain. And I've had great mentors. At this time, I think we've had so many questions, and you've been a marvelous audience, and I'd like to thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you. Judge, your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson, so much. And I offer to my students for notice. First of all, let me please recognize again Louis Anderson. Would you stand? I tell him they're the sharpest couple in town. That other third of that triumvirate that was so influential in my student days Dr. Anderson and Dr. George Mr. Johnson, who just came in. And I'd like to recognize also my wonderful friend and colleague, Dr. Dwight Andrews, who is not only pastor at the First Congregational Church here in Atlanta, but is also professor of composition at Emory, PhD from Yale University. And a wonderful jazz musician and composer in his own right. You will know his work from having written music for August Wilson's plays, and we're very honored that you took the time to come. All of you who've come as guests, thank you so much for being here. Laura English Robinson, who you know was in Premonition, as I mentioned before. And I also mentioned earlier Ms. Jacqueline Howard, she was honored on last Friday evening, student of Dr. Anderson, for her work in pedagogy in terms of teaching and communicating with kids who have disabilities in visually limited students. And quite nice segment that was done on the NBC Nightly News. But I want to say, you get a sense of the dynamics of this man's personality. Some of my students have heard, I was going to say, Dr. Anderson, you can hear it in this voice now. Good ideas. None of them hold together. That was one joke when he says he wrote some bad music and you think everything is wonderful. But it really cuts to the bone when you get that kind of statement. But the point here is very simply that this man is a link to, and having studied with Darius Milhaud, if you notice that, among these other wonderful composers, he's a link to an historical part of the best of African American music, and the honor of being able to claim that association with Morehouse as we continue to try to do what we do and have him come back now beyond being, he's in his octogenarian years, and he looks better than most of us, and I attribute Mrs. Ellison to part of that. But it's such a wonderful thing. So you are grandchildren and great-grandchildren of that legacy, and those of you who are students here. And what an honor it has been, Dr. Anderson. You can come visit us anytime you want and teach a class or two or whatever, but we're delighted that he is living here in town. Thank you all so much. Our guests from Calvary, we appreciate so much your coming, ladies and gentlemen. There's a small reception out in the lobby immediately following this. Again, thank you very much for a wonderful evening.
Yeah, I'll give you a call.